And we can see here that typically we are often getting up to thicknesses of 0.3, 0.4. In some designs, you're even 0.5 or more. And of course, they can vary with prescription and other aspects of the design. So of course, we're dealing with quite dramatic T values when we're thinking about oxygen transmissibility, or dK over T. So thickness increases, and therefore a silicon hydrogel material, of course, becomes important. So how do the designers go about stabilizing these things? Well, briefly, this is what you might call the classical approach to it, and it's really based on a circular motion, given that most contact lenses are, even when they're molded, life starts for the mold as a circular lathing action. And so, understandably, sort of offset approaches and others were tried, so we end up with designs that classically have looked like this. But that circular coordination design, as it can be called, does have some really distinct drawbacks. And for those of you who have used a lot of toric lenses over the years, you'll know that there's probably nothing more frustrating than a toric lens that doesn't behave, or doesn't behave like the last one in particular. And this is why. And it's because you're using an approach that's really devilishly difficult to keep everything consistent, and more importantly, to have things exactly as you wish. So we can say that we have to have multiple offset contours to generate those rotational forces, but in creating those thinner and thicker zones, we can't really optimize them in the way we'd like. We have to effectively go with the flow, and so some of the thicknesses are greater than we ideally want, and some of them are thinner. And keeping everything symmetrical about a vertical midline, which is critical if the lens is not to twist a long way, is difficult with this approach. And so we get uneven interactions, orientations are less predictable, and significantly, the whole orientation system can vary with the prescription. So you have a patient, you need to adjust the cil axis, and lo and behold, you do that, and then the lens orientates in a different place, and you end up chasing your tail. So quite some time ago, we took a different approach. And this, in a simple sense, is the CooperVision way of doing it. So we have the technology, as they say in the best science fiction movies. We have the technology, and we call this an optimized geometry approach. So this way of using Cartesian coordinates, what this really boils down to is specifying things not in a circular basis, but point by point, pixel by pixel, if you like, and being able to control for thicknesses exactly as you want. A lot of benefits flow from this. You can control the thicknesses precisely, you can control symmetry very, very well about the vertical midline, and importantly, because you can use all the available area outside the optic zone to generate stabilization features, you can get a lot of stability with a relatively thin design. So I'm not trying to say that these lenses are as thin as a sphere, they're certainly not, but generally speaking, they are at the thinner end of the toric lens spectrum. And so that design technology that you've become, I hope, familiar with bioaffinity toric is included, well, is exactly the same in the MyDay toric lens. And of course, this technology has done phenomenally well since it was introduced eight years ago, and it's certainly the #1 toric product in this part of the world, and indeed in many other places as well. Some of the features of it, there's more than 4, but we just highlight 4 here, and in fact I highlight one with a big red arrow for some reason. But we refer to this high degree of symmetry across the lens as being uniform horizontal iso thickness, so iso, same, similar. And that is what leads to a lot of predictability. The surface being very smooth is important, as we'll see. This large toric optic zone, that's good because when you start to go to higher cils, and if your optic zones on the back surface start to reduce, then vision can be compromised, where sometimes flare can arise. So although that doesn't really contribute to lens stability, it's certainly a critical part of the optical performance of the lens. And as you've seen, we take a great deal of care with this sort of pixel by pixel approach to control the thicknesses exactly and generate them exactly as we wish. So in simple terms, you can think of our optimized toric lens geometry as starting with the basis of a prism. As we know, prisms also are a bit like watermelon seeds, and if you were looking closely at that Mike Kilpatrick paper, you would have seen that he referred to watermelon seeds, and this is simply because they approximate the sort of squeeze forces you have when your lid blinks down across a toric lens quite nicely. So you squeeze a watermelon seed, you can make it go a long way because they're thicker at one end and thinner at the other. And we get this sort of ejection going on. So what we want to do is be able to control that inherent force from the thicknesses and the blink. You can think of the lens being something like that, but of course you then make it in a far more sophisticated manner as that point-by-point design. But here's a contrast between what we might say is that traditional approach and this Cartesian coordinate point-by-point approach, and you have this much greater control as a result. We're using, as I say, all of this area outside the optic zone, and that's why a lens like Biofinity Toric, and you'll find MyDay Toric, is so tremendously predictable, incredibly stable, and nearly always orientates where you want it. Smooth surfaces are important because if you are going to go to all the trouble of designing these stabilization features, if the lid should have any difficulty in smoothly moving across the surface of the lens, it will not only potentially affect comfort, but it can certainly affect, again, the orientational stability of the lens as well. So we put a lot of attention into making sure those relatively complex shapes on the front surface of the toric are very well blended, they're very smooth. And if we look at the performance of MyDay Toric, we've just got a comparison here and show you with a couple of the other one-day torics on the market. Now this is the part where I show you some results, and our lens comes out better than the other guys. So if that sort of thing always causes you a huge problem, you can look away now. But it was done in a double-blind study, honest, so nobody knew what they were looking at. And so this is just looking very simply at how lenses orientate when they go on the eye and settle down at baseline. So just as after a short settling time, and you can see that MyDay Toric, rather like its counterpart by stablemate Biofinity Toric, has a very high proportion of the lenses settled within 10 degrees of 6 o'clock, and quite a few, 3/4 basically, settle within 5. So that's what you really want, of course. The specifications of the lens. We know that one of the factors that has stopped the growth of the one-day market has been the fact that not a tremendously wide number of parameters have been available. It is economically a challenge to produce a one-day lens in thousands of different parameters, which is what you start to think about with torics. Biofinity Toric, for example, has over 4,000 variations in its off-the-shelf form, and then if you go to Biofinity Toric, you're starting to go up into past 10,000. So you're getting really, really large numbers. And that's very difficult to maintain for a one-day lens. But nonetheless, we've taken it further than we've taken it before, and as a starting place, we have a specification that looks like this. So it's the MyDay material, of course, hence the name. So Steve is going to talk in more depth about that. It's an 8/6-14/5 lens. We'll have a look at the spheres and sills and axes on the next slide. 0.1 millimeters, that's pretty typical for a toric, perhaps a little bit slimmer than most of them. But of course, this is what you really like to see, very high permeability and transmissibility values, albeit we're just doing the usual thing and looking at the center of a -3 lens there. Isn't that convenient? That's nice, high transmissibility value. There we go. Of course, we have the UV inhibitor. We think that's pretty important. All of our one-day lenses, all of our one-day silicon lenses have a UV inhibitor. The starting parameter range looks like this. So available right now, 4 axes, 0.75 through to -225. That's for all these minus powers up to -10. And you can see we've got a range of 10 axes for the 3 sills that you use most often, and you've got 6 for the 225 sill. 225 sill, by the way, when we look at our usage of Biofinity Toric, it's something like 5% of the sales or less. So most people need an 0.75 or a 125 sill. Higher sills, you remember them, but they're relatively rare. Plus powers aren't available yet. Yes, you know, hyperopes always have to suffer, but they'll be coming. Importantly, this configuration, though, is such that when we look at all the Biofinity Toric lenses that leave CooperVision and go out to optometry practices in Australia and New Zealand, we see that this configuration here would cover 94% of the orders. So although we haven't got some of the oblique axes, we are enabling you to cover a tremendous range of the prescriptions that you are going to prescribe. so more than 9 out of 10. The health of the eye is obviously fundamental. We have a philosophy in our R&D group, which is we let the eye decide which way it's going to go when we're trying to evolve new technologies. And of course, we're familiar with these stories now, but of course it always behoves us to pay attention to them, because the contact lens market, as I've said earlier, has always got this sort of bipolar nature to it. We've got the existing patients, and we're trying all the new and exciting things on them. And then we've got the much larger group of existing patients. So new patients get to try the new toys. The existing patients, well, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, because they're happy. They're fine, aren't they? But when we look at the literature and the research, and who better to review it than Professors Des Fon and Debbie Sweeney. Debbie, obviously, has probably even taught some of you. And they've reviewed the literature around prescribing silicone hydrogels and one-day lenses at the end of 2015, and a couple of their conclusions. There's no need to really put up with inducing hypoxia for any patient these days. There's very few situations when you can't prescribe a one-day silicone hydrogel, and now that you've got 2 one-day silicone hydrogel torics, then the opportunity to bring complete oxygen performance to more of your patients is there. So we need to pay attention to that, and of course their conclusion is this: it's very simple. Ideally, a one-day silicone hydrogel is where you should start. That's going to give the patient the best chance of successful long-term contact lens wear. And after all, as I'm fond of saying, as a living, walking example, I've been wearing contact lenses for over 30 years, and typically when you fit patients today, they're 18, 17, 25. How long do they want to wear them for? Well, decades, potentially for the rest of their lives. So on that basis, I think, as healthcare practitioners, we are always going to try to start with the optimum physiological situation, and you'd have to make a strong case for that being a one-day silicone hydrogel. And when we look at what happens, I talked about the centre of the lenses, but when we look at oxygen transmissibility, and Steve's going to bring more to this, so I won't linger on this, we can see with these oxygen transmissibility profiles, basically greens and blues are where you want to be, those high DKVT values. We're looking at whole lens DKVT profiles here for low minus or mid minus and higher minus lenses. And you can see that when you go to something like a silicone hydrogel, this is a much, much different situation to when you're in the hydrogel area. So you're getting these sort of DKVT values. These are averages here, averages. And of course, you should always be concerned with what's the worst point. And you can see that the low points in something like a MyDay toric lens are still very, very good in terms of satisfying the cornea's oxygen requirement. The lens, as I said, features a UV inhibitor, and MyDay blocks 85% of UVA and 96% of UVB. We think UV blocking is really important. I mean, this is Australia, sort of skin cancer capital of the world. Unless you go to New Zealand, they claim that too, but you can have the Deputy Prime Minister. And interestingly, Australian practitioners think so too. I've been doing this question for the last 3 years, and this is moving every time. And this is now easily the most positive response in terms of saying that prescribing a UV inhibitor or having a UV inhibitor in a contact lens is, nearly half of the 378 optometrists I surveyed said that they considered that very important. And most of the rest said it was somewhat important. And then there's the 8% who had dinner and said, thank you very much, but I'll stick without the UV blocker. So I'll wrap things up now by just simply saying, getting some of the boring housekeeping out of the way, but perhaps also a more interesting part if you want to prescribe the product. Trial sets, plural, because there are 3 of them. You can have an 075, a 125, or a 175. If you want a 225, you can't have one. Okay. We would recommend for many situations having the 075 and the 125, because that will cover a tremendous range of potential prescriptions just from a trial set. But if you have all 3, you go even further than that. So they look like this. If you've got acres of space in your practice and you don't know what to put there, pot plants aren't covering it, then go for one of our full trial set arrangements. OptiExpert, if you haven't got it on your phone, you should download it from Android or Apple places, and that will shortly feature MyDay Toric in there as well. And we have a nice wheel there that you may have picked up to help you sort out which parameters are available. So in closing, I'd say that MyDay Toric is one of the products in our portfolio which also benefits from the fact that thanks to a legal opinion obtained a couple of years ago now, every CooperVision product launched since 2015 has been optometry only across Australia and New Zealand. It's something we can't control for the world, but MyDay Toric joins the Clarity family and Biofinity Energis, lenses like that, as being only sold to the optometry channel. And so, well, thank you. Okay, good. You like that. And really that concludes what I have to say. So I hope that sets up an understanding of MyDay in terms of what we are providing to you and specification and the design philosophy behind it, and why we believe it really is the best thing you can put on an astigmat's eye in 2017. And what I'm going to do now is introduce you